Inside the crystal-lit ballroom of Manhattan's most exclusive gala, a man stepped through the doors, wearing a worn, cheap suit, completely out of place, among hundreds of billionaires draped in silk and diamonds. A heartbeat later, the entire hall fell silent. The champagne glass slipped from the hand of the night's most powerful CEO and shattered across the marble floor. Her eyes widened. Her breath caught as she recognized him. The man she had forced to disappear 5 years ago had returned, and what terrified her more was that he had not come alone. The story didn't begin in that ballroom. It began long before, in a city where wealth decided who deserved to be seen and who deserved to vanish. Ethan Carter once had a name worth something, not in finance, not in real estate, but in kitchens, where every plate had to be perfect. He had built his reputation slowly, learning under harsh chefs who threw plates and broke spirits. By the time he was hired into the Whitmore household, he was considered one of the most promising private chefs in the city. He was quiet, exact, and unwilling to compromise on his work. That last quality was the one Adrian Whitmore noticed first. The Whitmore name carried weight in New York, the way a verdict carried weight in a courtroom. Adrian had built the company from nothing, and over the decades, he had taught everyone around him that loyalty to the family was the only currency that mattered. He moved through rooms with the calm of a man who had never been told no. To him, employees were tools, friends were assets, and family was a reflection of power. His daughter Isabella Whitmore had been raised inside that machine. By her late 20s, she had already become exactly what her father wanted: composed, intelligent, surgical, and business decisions. She held a senior executive title that the financial press described as a stepping stone, and most analysts assumed she would inherit the company within the decade. People feared her, respected her, but almost no one claimed to know her. Behind that polished surface, something else lived: a quiet exhaustion, a sense that every smile had been rehearsed, and every conversation had been scripted long before she walked into the room. Isabella had everything the world could measure, and almost nothing the world could not. Their three lives, Ethan's discipline, Isabella's silence, and Adrian's authority, would never have collided in a fair world. But the Whitmore estate operated under its own gravity. The man who cooked their meals lived under the same roof as the woman who would one day inherit the empire. And in that narrow space between the kitchen and the dining room, a story began that none of them would survive untouched. It started without either of them noticing. Late nights at the Whitmore estate often left Isabella alone in the dining room with an untouched plate. She rarely ate. She read reports through dinner, drank black coffee, and ignored the staff. Most chefs would have stopped trying. Ethan didn't. He kept sending out simple dishes, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress. A bowl of soup, a piece of fish, the kind of food someone made for a person, not a client. One evening, she walked into the kitchen herself. She didn't say much. She watched him work for a few minutes, then asked him why he kept cooking when she never ate. He told her he wasn't cooking for the woman in the magazines. He was cooking for whoever was left at the end of the day. That answer stayed with her longer than it should have. After that, the line between employer and employee began to soften in places no one was watching. She started eating in the kitchen instead of the dining room. He started leaving small notes on her plates, never sentimental, just brief observations about the food, sometimes about the weather. They talked about cities they had never seen. They talked about families that had never made room for them. He never asked about the company. She never asked about his past. For the first time in years, she felt like she was speaking to a person who didn't want anything from her. The relationship didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden kiss in a hallway. It grew the way slow things grow in places that do not allow for slowness. A glance held a second too long. A hand brushing another hand near the stove. A laugh that no one inside that house had heard from her in years. Ethan understood the risk before she did. He knew what kind of family he was working for. He knew what happened to men who forgot their place under the Whitmore roof. For Isabella, it was simpler and more dangerous. He gave her something she didn't know she had been missing, the strange relief of being seen as a human being instead of a name. In the world her father had built, that feeling was more valuable than any contract. It was also the one thing the family would never allow her to keep. They became careful. Then, they became reckless. Months passed in stolen evenings and quiet conversations no one was supposed to hear. 2 members of the household staff, a senior housekeeper, and a butler who had been with the family for over a decade, saw enough to understand what was happening, but neither said a word. They both knew the cost of speaking, and they both knew the cost of not speaking. They chose silence the way most people in that house chose silence. What neither Ethan nor Isabella understood in those early months was that Adrian Whitmore had already noticed. He had noticed weeks before either of them suspected. He was simply waiting for the right moment to act. Adrian didn't confront them. That wasn't his style. Men who had built empires from silence rarely raised their voices. Instead, on a Tuesday morning, he summoned Ethan to his private study and closed the door behind him. There were no witnesses inside the room. There never were when Adrian Whitmore did the things he didn't want remembered. But the housekeeper had watched Ethan walk down the corridor, and the butler had been the one to bring him in. They both noted the time. Adrian didn't accuse Ethan of anything. He simply slid an envelope across the desk and explained in a calm and steady tone what was inside. A severance offer, a non-disclosure agreement, a list of restaurants in 3 states that had already been informed Ethan was no longer to be considered for any position. The message was clear before a single threat was made. Ethan was finished. The only question was how quietly he would leave. Ethan tried to speak. Adrian cut him off with a single sentence, delivered without anger. He told Ethan that men in cheap suits didn't marry into the Whitmore name, and that whatever Ethan thought he had with Isabella ended the moment he walked out of that office. If Ethan refused to sign, Adrian would make sure no kitchen in the country ever hired him again. If he signed, he would be allowed to disappear with his name intact, even if his career would never recover. Ethan asked to see Isabella. Adrian refused. He said Isabella had already been informed and that she had agreed it was the right decision. That part was a lie, but Ethan had no way of knowing it in that moment. He stared at the envelope. He thought about every conversation in that kitchen, every quiet evening, every promise that had been made without being spoken aloud. Then he signed. Isabella didn't learn the truth until that night. By then, Ethan was already gone. His room had been emptied, his contract terminated, his name removed from the household records as if he had never existed. She went to her father's study and demanded an explanation. Adrian gave her the version of the story he had prepared. Ethan had taken money. Ethan had walked away. Ethan had chosen the easier path. He told her that any man willing to be bought was never worth fighting for in the first place. She had a choice in that moment, and she knew it. She was 28 years old already, a senior executive already being groomed as the eventual successor. She could leave the house, walk into the city, and look for him. She could refuse the inheritance, refuse the company, refuse the name. She could trade everything her family had built for a man who until that morning had only ever cooked her dinner and listened to her talk. Or she could stay. She could believe her father. She could close the door on the kitchen and never open it again. She stayed. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself she would understand later why this was the right thing. She didn't cry that night or the night after. The silence she chose in that moment would shape every year that followed, and it would not break until 5 years later on the marble floor of a ballroom. Ethan didn't go far. He moved into a small apartment in Queens, took a job washing dishes at a diner that paid him in cash, and stopped using his real name on applications. The restaurants Adrian had warned didn't even need to reject him. Word traveled faster than paper. By the end of the first month, every chef who once returned his calls had stopped picking up. By the end of the first year, his name had been quietly erased from the industry he had spent a decade building. He didn't fight it. He told himself the fight had already ended in Adrian's study. He learned to live small. He cooked for himself in a kitchen the size of a closet. He paid his rent in envelopes. He kept his head down on subway platforms and avoided the parts of the city where men in suits walked in groups. The version of him that had once written notes on dinner plates was still there, but he buried it deeper every month until even he started to forget what that man had sounded like. Isabella's life moved in the opposite direction. Within a year of Ethan's disappearance, Adrian formally promoted her to Chief Operating Officer. 2 years after that, she was named Chief Executive. The board approved her unanimously. Magazines that had once described her as a successor began describing her as the most powerful woman in Manhattan. She traveled negotiated closed deals that older men had failed to close for years. From the outside, she had become exactly what her father had built her to be. From the inside, she had become very quiet. She stopped eating in the kitchen. She stopped eating at home altogether. She held meetings during meals and slept in her office more often than in her bed. The staff replaced Ethan within a week, and then replaced his replacement within a month. Over the next 2 years, so many chefs cycled through the Whitmore kitchen that she stopped trying to remember any of their faces. That was the point. She had asked for it that way. She never spoke his name. Not to her father, not to her assistants, not to the few friends she still pretended to have. Sometimes a junior employee at the company would mention a restaurant opening or a chef being profiled in the press, and her chest would tighten for half a second before she forced her face back into neutrality. She told herself she had moved on. She told herself the version of her that had once stood in a kitchen at midnight had been a girl, and she was no longer a girl. The truth was simpler. She had built an empire on top of a wound, and the empire kept growing while the wound kept bleeding under the floorboards. Every year, the rumors about Ethan faded a little more. Every year, the silence between her and her father grew a little thicker. Adrian noticed, but he didn't speak of it. As far as he was concerned, the matter had been closed the day Ethan signed the papers. The fact that his daughter no longer laughed in his presence was to him an acceptable cost. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was held every spring at the plaza. It was the kind of event where the guest list was published in the financial press and the dress code was enforced at the door. 5 years after Ethan's name had been erased, Isabella stood near the center of the ballroom, holding a glass of champagne. She had no intention of drinking, listening to a senator's wife describe a charity she had no intention of remembering. She felt the shift in the room before she saw the cause. Conversations didn't stop all at once. They thinned the way a tide pulls back before it returns. Heads turned. A few voices dropped to whispers. She turned with them, half out of habit, half out of instinct. And that was when she saw him. Ethan stood near the entrance in a dark suit that did not belong in that room. The fabric was wrong. The cut was wrong. He had clearly bought it off a rack and worn it without alteration. Around him, men in tailored Italian wool and women in jewelry, worth more than his apartment building, stared with the polite cruelty of people who had been raised to recognize wealth at 50 paces. He didn't look uncomfortable. He looked like someone who had stopped caring how he looked a long time ago. Isabella's hand opened on its own. The champagne glass slipped, hit the marble floor, and broke in a way that drew every remaining eye in the ballroom. She didn't move to clean it. She didn't apologize to the senator's wife. She stared across the room at a man she had spent 5 years convincing herself she had forgotten, and found that her body remembered him before her mind could catch up. Ethan saw her. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. His expression didn't change at all, which was somehow worse than any reaction he could have given. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, the way a person looks at a closed door they no longer plan to open. Then he turned and began walking deeper into the ballroom calmly, as if he had every right to be there. The room understood in the way rooms like that always understand that something had just happened. Phones came out under tables. Conversations restarted with new subjects. 2 of Adrian's senior associates moved toward Isabella from opposite ends of the room, both wearing the same controlled expression. She lifted a hand without looking at them, and they stopped. She didn't approach Ethan. She couldn't. Her legs felt borrowed. She watched him cross the floor, watched the crowd part for him without realizing they were doing it, and understood for the first time that he was not the same man her father had pushed out of a study 5 years ago. The man in the cheap suit was not asking to be let back in. He had come to be seen. There was a difference, and the entire room could feel it. Adrian arrived at her side a minute later. He spoke quietly close to her ear, asking her what she wanted him to do. She didn't answer. She kept her eyes on Ethan, who had stopped near the far wall, and accepted a glass of water from a passing server, and she realized that the story she had told herself for 5 years, that Ethan had been bought, that Ethan had walked away, that Ethan had chosen the easier path, was about to come apart in front of every person in that room. The shape of her life changed in that moment. She just didn't know yet how completely. By morning, the photographs would be everywhere, and the questions would not stop coming. The first article appeared at 6 in the morning. By 9, 3 more had followed. None of them named Ethan directly. The press hadn't pieced together who he was, yet, but the photograph of Isabella Whitmore staring across a ballroom with broken glass at her feet had already been licensed to every major outlet in the city. The headlines were vague and hungry. Something about the CEO. Something about a stranger. Something about a face she clearly recognized. By 10, the Whitmore communications team had assembled in a conference room without being asked. Adrian was already there. He gave instructions without raising his voice. He wanted Ethan's identity contained. He wanted the photograph buried under 3 news stories by the end of the day. He wanted any reporter sniffing in the wrong direction reminded gently of which advertisers funded their parent company. The team understood. They had done this before for other things. Isabella sat at the end of the table and listened. She didn't argue. She didn't agree. She watched her father coordinate the suppression of a man's existence with the same efficiency he had used 5 years earlier, and she felt something cold settle in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure which side of the table she was on. That afternoon, 2 reporters tried to approach Ethan outside his apartment. He didn't speak to them. He didn't run. He simply walked past them to the diner, where he still washed dishes, picked up his shift, and worked until midnight. When the reporters returned the next day, the building's owner, who had received a phone call from someone who would not give his name, informed them politely that they were trespassing. Inside the company, the pressure tightened in subtler ways. Isabella's calendar filled with sudden meetings she had not requested. Board members began calling her directly, asking about a personal matter they claimed to have heard about secondhand. An old family lawyer she hadn't spoken to in 2 years sent her a single message asking whether she was available for lunch. She wasn't naive. She knew what each of those signals meant. The family was making sure she remembered which name she carried before she made any decisions. Her own staff began watching her differently. The assistant who had worked beside her for 4 years stopped making eye contact. A vice president she trusted sent her a memo full of language that didn't sound like his own. Somewhere above her, in rooms, she wasn't invited to decisions were being made about how much of her life she was still allowed to control. The wound she had buried under 5 years of work had reopened in a single night, and the family that had caused it was now closing ranks around the bleeding. She understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that she could not stay neutral much longer. The choice she had refused to make at 28 was waiting for her again, and this time, the room was watching. She found Ethan 4 days after the gala. She didn't send a driver. She didn't have her assistant call ahead. She took a cab to Queens, paid in cash, and walked the last 3 blocks to his building because she didn't want any record of where she had gone. He answered the door without surprise, as if he had been expecting her and had simply not known on which day she would arrive. The apartment was smaller than she had imagined, clean but bare. A single chair near the window, a kitchen the size of a hallway. He didn't offer her anything. He sat on the edge of the bed and waited for her to speak, and she realized she had spent the entire cab ride preparing a sentence she could no longer remember. She asked him why he had come to the gala. He told her he hadn't come for her. He told her a man he used to work with had bought him the ticket as a favor, and he had spent 3 weeks deciding whether to use it. He told her that when he walked into the ballroom, he hadn't been sure if she would even recognize him. The way he said it without bitterness was worse than any accusation she could have prepared for. She tried to explain what her father had told her 5 years ago. She started to tell him about the money, about the version of the story Adrian had given her, about why she had stayed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her one question. He asked her if she had ever in 5 years tried to find him to confirm the story. She didn't answer because they both already knew. That night, she went directly from his apartment to her father's house. She didn't knock. She walked into Adrian's study the way she had walked in at 28, and this time, she didn't sit down. She told him she knew Ethan had never taken the money. She told him she knew there had been no negotiation, no choice, no walkaway. She told him she had spent 5 years building a company on top of a lie he had handed her like a gift. Adrian didn't deny any of it. That was the part that broke her. He simply looked at her across the same desk where he had pushed an envelope at Ethan 5 years earlier, and he told her calmly that he had done what any father in his position would have done. He told her the company had grown under her leadership precisely because she had been free of distractions. He told her the truth wouldn't have served her at 28, and he wasn't sure it served her at 33 either. She walked out of the study without answering him. By the time she reached her car, the second collapse had already started. Ethan, who had spent 4 days deciding whether to speak to anyone, learned that night through a former colleague that an internal Whitmore memo had been circulated, describing him as a former staff member with a history of inappropriate conduct toward Ms. Whitmore. The memo was being prepared for selective release if the press dug too deep. He read the message twice. Then he turned off his phone and sat in the dark. 5 years of silence, and they were still rewriting him. He had come to the gala to be seen, and the family was about to use that visibility to bury him a second time. For the first time since the day he had signed the papers, Ethan stopped believing that telling the truth would matter. The story had a shape now, and it was not his to control. The next morning, Isabella did not go to the office. She drove herself, which she hadn't done in years, to a small storage facility in Long Island City, where the company kept its older internal records. She used her executive credentials to sign in and asked the clerk to leave her alone. She spent the next 6 hours pulling files from boxes labeled with dates that no one had touched in half a decade. She found the original separation agreement Ethan had signed. She found the wire transfer records that Adrian had cited as proof of payment. And she saw for the first time that the account number listed had never belonged to Ethan. It belonged to a holding company her father had used to move money between family interests. The settlement had never reached him. It had been routed back into the estate within 72 hours of being authorized. She sat in that storage room with the file open in her lap and understood completely and without comfort that her father had not simply lied to her about Ethan's choice. He had built an entire paper trail to make sure she could never accidentally find the truth. The lie had been engineered. She had been the audience he had spent the most time deceiving. That evening, Adrian called an emergency meeting of the family's inner circle at the estate. He did not invite Isabella. She came anyway. She walked into the dining room in the same building where she had once eaten quietly with a man no one had wanted her to love, and she told the assembled lawyers and senior officers that she would not authorize the release of any internal memo concerning Ethan Carter. She told them that any document already drafted would be retracted. She told them that if a single one of them leaked anything to the press, she would resign publicly the same afternoon and explain why. Adrian's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. He had not expected her to be willing to burn the company down. The men around the table looked at him, then at her, then back at him. No one needed it. Explained that the line of authority in the Whitmore family had just moved. Ethan, in his apartment across the river, was making his own decision. A reporter he had refused to speak to had finally reached him by leaving a note under his door. The note didn't ask for an interview. It said that the writer had spoken to 2 former Whitmore employees, the senior housekeeper and the longtime butler, who had been present in the household the week Ethan had been pushed out. Both were willing on record to confirm what had happened in Adrian's study 5 years ago. They had been waiting, the note said, for someone to ask the right questions. Ethan held the note for a long time. He thought about the apartment, the diner, the 5 years of silence he had built around himself like a coat. He thought about the woman who had sat on his bed 3 days earlier and asked the wrong question too late. He thought about the man who had pushed an envelope across a desk and decided on his own what other people's lives were worth. Then he picked up the phone and called the reporter back. The story ran 4 days later on the front page of a Sunday business section that the Whitmore family had courted carefully for 3 decades. It did not editorialize. It did not need to. It laid out the documents, the dates, the wire transfers, and the on-record testimony of the housekeeper and the butler, who had spent more than a decade inside the Whitmore household and had finally chosen to speak. By the time the print edition reached the city's newsstands, the digital version had already been read more than 2 million times. Adrian's communications team had no response prepared because Isabella had instructed them not to prepare one. She had the day before publication signed a brief statement of her own and sent it directly to the same paper. In it, she confirmed every fact in the article. She confirmed that she had been misled by her own family. She confirmed that the man named in the story had never accepted any payment, never signed any settlement, and had been pushed out of the household under conditions she now considered unconscionable. She did not ask for sympathy. She asked simply that the record be corrected. The board met within 48 hours. Adrian, who had run the family company for the better part of 40 years, was asked to step back from operational decisions. He agreed because there was no version of the meeting in which he could refuse without making the situation worse. The press release used careful language. Anyone who had read the Sunday article understood what had actually happened. Ethan did not give a second interview. He did not appear on television. The restaurants that had quietly blacklisted him began one by one to reach out through intermediaries. He answered none of them. He kept his job at the diner for another 2 months, partly because he had given his word to the owner, and partly because he was no longer sure he wanted to return to the world that had erased him. Isabella came to see him a second time in the same apartment without an apology prepared. She told him she did not expect him to forgive her. She told him she did not expect anything at all. She told him only that she was no longer the woman who had stayed silent at 28, and that the rest of her life, however it unfolded, would be lived as someone willing to ask the second question. He listened. He didn't promise her anything. But when she stood up to leave, he asked her quietly if she was hungry. It was the first meal he had cooked for her in 5 years. It was a simple piece of fish, the same kind he used to send out to an empty dining room. They ate it in the small kitchen on 2 mismatched plates, and neither of them spoke for most of it. When they were finished, she didn't go back to the estate. She didn't go back to her office. She stayed, and for the first time since she had walked out of her father's study at 28, she felt herself begin to exhale. They didn't try to rebuild what they had lost. There was no point, and they both understood that. The 2 people who had stood in the Whitmore kitchen at midnight 5 years earlier no longer existed. What they built instead was something quieter, slower, and more honest than anything that house had ever allowed. Isabella stepped down as chief executive within the year. She didn't sell her shares, and she didn't disappear, but she handed daily control of the company to a board she had spent 6 months restructuring. The Whitmore name continued in the financial press, but the tone of the coverage changed. The family was no longer described as untouchable. That word, more than any settlement or apology, was the one Adrian found hardest to live with. Adrian himself was not destroyed. Men like him rarely are. He kept his estate, his name, his standing in certain rooms that had not yet caught up with the news. But the daughter who had once executed his strategies without question now answered his calls more slowly and visited the estate only when she chose to. He understood in his own quiet way that the version of authority he had spent his life perfecting did not work on her anymore. He never apologized to Ethan. He was not built for that. Ethan opened a small restaurant in Brooklyn the following spring. It had 12 tables and no investors. He cooked simple food, the kind that didn't make magazine covers, and the kitchen ran on his terms for the first time in his career. Isabella came in most evenings after the dinner rush, sat in the back, and ate whatever he sent out without looking at the menu. The staff stopped asking her name within a week. They never made a public statement about being together. They never denied it either. The press lost interest faster than anyone had expected, because the story without conflict was no longer a story. What remained was something the Whitmore family had spent generations trying to outrun. Power can shape a life, can move its pieces, can decide who gets remembered and who gets erased. But it cannot replace the truth, and it cannot replace the courage to live by it. The people who survive their own families are usually the ones who stop asking permission. Growth begins the moment a person decides to be responsible for their own choices, instead of carrying the weight of choices someone else made for them.